I woke up that morning to the smell of coffee drifting through our quiet suburban house, the kind of place where you'd think nothing ever goes wrong. My name's Marcus Reynolds, and I'm a software engineer, good at my job, steady, reliable. It's been enough to keep me, my wife Linda, and our 17-year-old son Caleb living comfortably. The house is small but cozy, with a big oak tree out front and a backyard where Caleb used to kick a soccer ball around when he was younger. Things looked peaceful on the outside, like one of those perfect family pictures you see in a frame at the store. But inside, well, that's a different story. Linda and I had been married for nearly 20 years, and whatever love we'd started with had faded into something cold and distant. We stayed together for Caleb, though our boy was the glue holding this shaky thing together. That morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through some emails on my laptop. Caleb was across from me, eating a bowl of cereal, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he focused on his phone. He's a quiet kid, thoughtful, with a mind full of music and stories, stuff Linda never really understood. She was in the other room, getting ready for work. Linda's in finance, always proud of how she can manage money better than anyone else, especially me. She'd remind me of it every chance she got, like it was some kind of trophy she'd won. I didn't argue much anymore. It wasn't worth the fight. Then her phone rang, loud and sharp, cutting through the morning calm. I glanced up as she answered it, her voice brightening the second she heard who it was. "Rachel, hey, how's everything?" she said, putting it on speaker like she always did when her sister called. Rachel's voice came through, loud and excited, filling the kitchen. "April just won another academic award. Mom and Dad are over the moon about it." I could practically see Linda's chest puff up with pride, even though it wasn't her kid who'd done anything. April's Rachel's daughter, our niece, and she's always been the golden child in this family. Straight A's, perfect test scores, the works. Linda acted like April's wins were hers too, like she'd somehow had a hand in raising her. Caleb didn't say anything, just kept eating his cereal, but I caught the way his shoulders slumped a little. He was used to this by now, Linda comparing him to April, making him feel like he didn't measure up. I hated it. My boy's got talent, real talent, just not the kind Linda cares about. He writes songs on his guitar late at night, and I've read some of his stories. Deep, beautiful stuff that makes you feel something. But to Linda, if it's not grades or money, it's not worth much. I gave him a small smile across the table, trying to let him know I saw him, that I was proud of who he was. He looked back at me, his eyes softening a bit, and I knew he got it. Rachel kept talking, her voice buzzing through the speaker. "By the way, Mom and Dad want to have dinner soon to celebrate April's award. Oh, and they said we'll talk about some important financial matters too." My stomach twisted the second I heard that. Financial matters? With Linda's family, that never meant anything good. They were the type to sit around a table and plot how to squeeze every penny out of a situation, especially if it meant looking better than someone else. Linda was grinning, already imagining whatever scheme they were cooking up, but I could feel the trouble coming like a storm rolling in over the horizon. I set my coffee mug down a little harder than I meant to, the clink loud enough to make Caleb glance up at me again. "You okay, Dad?" he asked quietly. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, bud. Just thinking." Linda hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile floor. She didn't even look at me, just started pouring herself a cup of coffee like nothing was wrong. "Rachel says April's going to some fancy award ceremony next week," she said, her tone smug. "Isn't that amazing?" I didn't answer right away, just watched her for a second. She didn't notice Caleb sitting there, didn't see the way he stared down at his bowl like he wished he could disappear into it. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice flat. "Real impressive." Linda shot me a look, but I didn't care. I knew something was off, something bigger than just another family dinner. And whatever it was, I had a bad feeling it was going to hit us hard. The rest of the morning went on like usual. Linda left for work. Caleb grabbed his backpack and headed to school, and I sat there at the table, staring out the window at that big oak tree. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out what financial matters Linda's parents wanted to talk about. I'd learned a long time ago not to trust them when it came to money, or Linda, for that matter. She'd always been good at twisting things to get what she wanted, and I'd seen her do it to me plenty of times. But Caleb? I'd be damned if I let her mess with him. He deserved better than that. Better than a family who only cared about him when he fit their idea of success. I finished my coffee and closed my laptop, already bracing myself for whatever was coming. It might have been quiet in the house right then, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The night of Caleb's 17th birthday dinner felt like it should have been a good one, a celebration for my boy turning into a man. We were at Bellissimo, this fancy Italian place downtown with dim lights and waiters in crisp white shirts who acted like they were doing you a favor by bringing your food. I'd picked it because Caleb loved their pasta, and I wanted him to have something special. He sat next to me at the big round table, his dark hair combed back for once, looking sharp in a button-up shirt I'd helped him iron that morning. Linda was on his other side, dressed up in a sleek black dress, her hair perfect as always. Across from us were her sister Rachel, her husband Tom, and their daughter April, all smiles and chatter. Linda's parents, Ed and Margaret, sat at the head of the table like they were king and queen of this little family empire, watching everything with those sharp eyes of theirs. I tried to keep things light at first, joking with Caleb about how he was old enough to drive us home if I had too much wine. He grinned at that, a real smile that lit up his face, and for a minute, it felt like maybe this night could just be about him. The food came out, big plates of spaghetti and garlic bread, and we all dug in, the clatter of forks and the hum of conversation filling the air. Rachel was going on about April's latest award, some academic thing she'd won at school, and Linda kept nodding like it was the most important news in the world. I didn't mind too much. I figured they'd get it out of their system eventually, and we could focus on Caleb. He deserved that much, especially tonight. But then Linda cleared her throat, loud enough that everyone stopped talking and looked at her. She picked up her wine glass, holding it high like she was about to give a toast, and I saw that wicked little smile on her face, the one she only got when she knew she was about to drop a bomb on someone. My stomach tightened, and I set my fork down, waiting. "Everyone," she said, her voice smooth and smug. "We have a special announcement tonight." The table went quiet, all eyes on her. Caleb glanced at me, confused, and I gave him a quick nod, trying to keep him calm even though I had no idea what was coming. I could feel the tension building, like the air before a lightning strike. After much consideration, Linda went on. "We've decided that Caleb's college fund will go to April instead." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my mind racing to make sure I'd heard her right. Caleb's fork slipped out of his hand and clattered onto his plate, the sound loud in the sudden silence. I looked at him, saw the shock in his wide eyes, the way his mouth opened but no words came out. My heart started pounding, a hot, angry rhythm in my chest, but I kept my face still, didn't let anyone see what I was feeling yet. Across the table, Rachel smirked, like she'd known this was coming, and April just sat there, looking pleased with herself. "What?" Caleb finally said, his voice small and shaky, like he couldn't believe it. Linda turned to him, her expression cold as ice. "Be realistic, Caleb," she said. "You're mediocre at best. Music and literature? Do you really think you'll succeed with that? April has a future at an Ivy League school. Your money is better spent on someone who won't waste it." I could feel the rage boiling up inside me, burning through every part of me, but I held it back. Caleb didn't deserve to see me lose it. Not yet. Rachel chimed in, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Of course, my child deserves it more," she said, her voice dripping with triumph. I couldn't take it anymore. I started to laugh, not a big, loud laugh, but a slow, deliberate one that made everyone turn to me. Linda's eyes narrowed, her smug look fading. "What's so funny?" she snapped. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my wine, letting the moment stretch out. "It's already paid for," I said, keeping my voice calm but sharp. The color drained from Linda's face, her glass trembling in her hand. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone rising. I set my wine down and looked right at her, letting her see the steel in my eyes. "You thought you had control over Caleb's future," I said. "But you don't. His tuition's been secured for years. That account you plan to steal from? It's empty." Linda shot up from her chair, her face twisting with fury. "You're lying," she hissed, loud enough that a few people at nearby tables glanced over. I just smiled, leaning back a little more, feeling the satisfaction settle into me like a warm drink on a cold day. "Am I?" I said, raising an eyebrow. She stood there, breathing hard, staring at me like she could make me take it back if she glared long enough. Caleb looked between us, his eyes wide, and I reached over to squeeze his hand under the table. "You're okay, bud," I whispered just for him. He nodded, still shaken, but I could see a flicker of relief in his face. The rest of the table was a mess. Rachel's mouth was open. Tom looked uncomfortable, and Linda's parents were whispering to each other, their faces tight with shock. Linda sat back down slowly, her hands clenched into fists on the tablecloth, but she didn't say anything else. I picked up my fork again, took a bite of my pasta, and chewed like nothing had happened. Inside, though, I was buzzing. Angry, yes, but also proud. I'd seen this kind of betrayal coming a mile away, and I'd made sure they couldn't touch Caleb's future. They thought they could walk all over us, but I turned the tables, and it felt good. Real good. The night wasn't over, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to forget this anytime soon. The restaurant was so quiet after I dropped that bombshell, you could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. The fancy chandeliers overhead seemed to flicker a little, casting shadows across the table where we all sat, frozen like statues in some messed-up family portrait. Linda was still standing, her fists balled up tight, her face red with anger she couldn't hide anymore. Caleb was next to me, his hands still under mine on the table, and I could feel the slight tremble in his fingers. My boy was shaken up, and it killed me to see him like that, but I kept my cool. I had to for him. Across from us, Rachel looked like she'd just swallowed something sour, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Her husband Tom shifted in his seat, avoiding my eyes, and Linda's parents, Ed and Margaret, sat there with their lips pressed thin, like they were trying to figure out how to spin this back in their favor. "You had no right," Linda finally spat out, her voice sharp and loud enough to make a waiter pause mid-step across the room. She pointed at me, her fingers shaking, like she could stab me with it if she tried hard enough. I didn't flinch, just took another slow sip of my wine, letting the rich taste roll over my tongue before I answered. "Actually, I did," I said, keeping my tone even, almost lazy. "I saw this betrayal coming years ago, so I moved the money into a private trust only Caleb can access when he's ready. It's done, Linda. You can't touch it." Her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she might scream, but she just stood there, breathing hard, like a cornered animal trying to figure out its next move. Rachel snapped out of her shock then, leaning forward with a scoff. "You tricked us," she said, her voice dripping with accusation, like I'd pulled some dirty con instead of protecting my own kid. I tilted my head a little, meeting her glare head-on. "No," I said. "I protected my son from people who never had his best interests at heart. That's what a parent does, Rachel. Maybe you wouldn't get it." Her face went pink, and she sat back quick, like I'd slapped her. Tom muttered something under his breath, but he didn't have the guts to say it out loud. Good. I wasn't in the mood for his nonsense anyway. Linda slammed her fists down on the table, making the wine glasses wobble and a little red splash onto the white tablecloth. "You'll regret this, Marcus," she snarled, her voice low and dangerous now, like she was promising something awful. I didn't blink, just looked at her, calm as ever, and took another sip of my wine. "No, Linda," I said, letting the words hang there for a second. "You will." Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe fear, and she sat down hard, crossing her arms like she could shield herself from what I'd just done. The rest of the table stayed quiet, the air thick with tension you could cut with a knife. Caleb shifted beside me, and I glanced at him. His face was pale, his dark eyes darting between me and his mom, like he was waiting for the next blow. I squeezed his hand again, letting him know I wasn't going anywhere. "It's okay, bud," I said soft, just for him. "We're good." He nodded a little, swallowing hard, and I could see he was trying to believe me. That's all I needed, for him to know I had his back, no matter what these vultures threw at us. Ed cleared his throat then, his deep voice cutting through the silence like he thought he could take charge. "Marcus," he said, "this is highly irregular. We need to discuss." I cut him off with a raised hand, not even looking at him. "There's nothing to discuss," I said. "The money's gone from where you thought it was. It's safe, and it's Caleb's. End of story." Margaret gasped, clutching her napkin like I'd just insulted her personally, but I didn't care. They'd sat there and let Linda and Rachel cook up this plan to rob my son blind, and I wasn't about to play nice with them now. Rachel tried again, her voice shrill. "You can't just do this, Marcus. That money it was never yours," I said, sharp enough to shut her up. It was for Caleb's future, not April's. You want to talk about rights? You had no right to even think about taking it. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking at Linda like she expected her to jump in. But Linda was too busy glaring at me, her jaw tight, her hands still clenched. I could tell she was running through every argument in her head, trying to find a way to turn this around. But she wasn't going to find one. I'd made sure of that years ago, back when I first noticed how she treated Caleb like he was less than April, less than her precious family's idea of success. The waiter came by then, hesitating as he looked at us, probably wondering if he should just back away slow. Dessert menus, he asked, his voice nervous. I waved him off. Not tonight, I said, keeping my eyes on Linda. The mood was shot, and I wasn't about to sit there pretending everything was fine while they licked their wounds. Caleb pushed his plate away, his food barely touched, and I felt another stab of anger at what they'd done to him. This was supposed to be his night, and they'd turned it into a battlefield. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, letting them stew in it. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, but I didn't mind. I'd said what I needed to, and they knew I wasn't bluffing. Linda's glare didn't let up, but I could see the cracks in her confidence, the way her shoulders slumped just a little. She'd thought she had me cornered, thought she could pull this off without me noticing, but I'd been one step ahead the whole time. And now? Now she'd have to live with it. I finished my wine, set the glass down with a soft clink, and waited. The night wasn't over, but this round was mine. The drive home from Bellissimo was like sitting in a pressure cooker with the lid screwed on tight. Nobody said a word. The hum of the car engine was the only sound, cutting through the thick silence that hung between us. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes on the road, the streetlights flashing by in streaks of yellow. Caleb was in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his face half lit by the passing glow. I could tell he was still reeling from what happened at dinner, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. Linda sat in the back, her arms crossed, her breathing loud and sharp, like she was holding in a storm she couldn't wait to let loose. I didn't look at her in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I could feel the heat of her anger radiating through the car, and I knew the second we got home, it was going to explode. We pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and I shut off the engine. Caleb opened his door quick, like he couldn't wait to get out, and I followed him, grabbing my keys from my pocket. Linda was slower, her heels clicking deliberate and loud on the pavement as she stepped out, slamming the car door hard enough to make me wince. I unlocked the front door of our house, the same quiet suburban place I'd woken up in that morning, and held it open for Caleb. He slipped past me, his head down, and I reached out to squeeze his shoulder as he went by. "You're going to college, son," I said low, just for him. "No one can take that from you." He looked up at me, his dark eyes searching mine, and gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me he trusted me, and that's all I cared about right then. Linda stormed in behind us, her purse hitting the entryway table with a loud thud. I closed the door, locking it slow and deliberate, buying myself a second to brace for what was coming. I didn't even get my jacket off before she spun around, her face twisted with fury. "How dare you embarrass me like that?" she shouted, her voice bouncing off the walls of our little house. I sighed, shrugging off my jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door, keeping my movements calm even though my pulse was starting to pick up. "How dare you try to steal from our son?" I said back, my tone steady but hard, like I was stating a fact she couldn't argue with. Her eyes widened, like she couldn't believe I'd throw it back at her, and she took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists. "Steal?" she snapped. "I was making a smart decision for this family. Caleb's not going anywhere with his little guitar and his stupid stories. You think that's a future? You're delusional, Marcus." I felt the anger flare up in my chest, hot and sharp, but I kept it locked down. I wasn't going to let her drag me into a screaming match, not with Caleb standing there in the living room, watching us like he didn't know where to go. I smirked instead, a small, tight curve of my lips that I knew would get under her skin. "Go ahead and try," I said, leaning against the wall, crossing my arms. "You've got nothing, Linda. That money's out of your reach, and you know it." Her face went redder, if that was even possible, and she pointed at me again, her fingers shaking. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Hiding it all these years, playing the big hero for Caleb. You're pathetic." I didn't bite, just watched her, letting her words bounce off me like rain on a windshield. I did what I had to, I said. You're the one who tried to sell out your own kid for your sister's precious April. Who's pathetic now? That hit her hard. I could see it in the way her mouth twitched, like she wanted to yell more, but didn't have the words. She turned away for a second, pacing the room, her heels clicking fast on the hardwood floor. Caleb spoke up then, his voice quiet but firm. Mom, why do you hate what I love so much? Linda stopped dead, spinning to look at him, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe just more anger. I don't hate it, Caleb, she said, her tone sharp. I just know it's not going to get you anywhere. You need to grow up and face reality. I stepped forward then, putting myself between them, because I wasn't going to let her tear him down anymore. Reality, I said, is that Caleb's got talent, and he's got a future. You don't get to decide what that looks like, Linda. Not anymore. She glared at me, her chest heaving, and I could tell she was itching to keep fighting, to find some way to come out on top. But she didn't have anything left, not tonight. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. You'll see. I nodded, not breaking eye contact. Sure, I said. We'll see. She turned on her heel and stormed upstairs, her footsteps heavy on the stairs, and I heard our bedroom door slam shut a second later. The house went quiet again, just me and Caleb standing there in the dim light of the living room. I turned to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. You okay? I asked. He nodded, but his eyes were shiny, like he was holding back tears. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Thanks, Dad. I pulled him into a quick hug, feeling his skinny frame against me, and for a moment, I just held him there, letting him know I wasn't going anywhere. Get some rest, I said when I let go. You've got a big day tomorrow. He gave me a small smile and headed to his room, leaving me alone in the quiet. I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. Linda was up there plotting, I knew that much, but I wasn't worried. I'd built that trust for Caleb years ago, back when I first saw the way she looked at him, like he was a disappointment she couldn't fix. She could fight all she wanted, but she wasn't going to win this one. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and let out a long breath. The war was on now, and I was ready for it. The next morning, the house felt like a battlefield after the smokes cleared, tense, quiet, but you could still smell the fight in the air. I was up early, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the same spot where this whole mess started yesterday. The sun was barely up, painting the room in soft gray light, and I was trying to enjoy the calm before whatever storm Linda had brewing upstairs. Caleb was still asleep, or at least I hoped he was. He'd had a rough night, and I wanted him to rest. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle into me, when I heard the doorbell ring. Sharp and loud, it cut through the silence like a warning. My gut told me this wasn't good. I got up, set my mug down, and walked to the front door, peering through the little window before I opened it. There they were, Linda's parents, Ed and Margaret, standing on the porch with Rachel right behind them, all three looking like they'd come to collect a debt. Ed's face was stern, Margaret's lips were pinched tight, and Rachel had that smug little tilt to her chin I'd always hated. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and swung it open. Morning, I said, keeping my voice neutral, like I didn't already know why they were here. Ed didn't waste time with pleasantries. We need to talk, Marcus, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invite. Margaret and Rachel followed, their shoes clicking on the floor as they brushed past me. I closed the door and turned to face them, crossing my arms. Guess this couldn't wait, I said, leaning against the wall. Linda came down the stairs then, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes still burning with that anger from last night. She must have called them over, set this little ambush up while I was sleeping. She stood next to her mom, arms crossed, mirroring me like we were squaring off. That money belongs to April, Margaret barked, her voice high and sharp, like she was scolding a kid. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my cool even though I could feel my temper simmering under the surface. No, I said, slow and clear. It belongs to Caleb. Always has. Rachel stepped forward, dropping a thick folder onto the coffee table with a loud smack. We've consulted lawyers, she said, her tone dripping with confidence. You had no right to move that money, Marcus. It's not legal. I glanced at the folder, then picked it up, flipping through the pages, some legal jargon, a few highlighted lines, nothing that looked real solid. I chuckled, a low, dry sound that made Rachel's smirk falter. "This is useless," I said, tossing it back onto the table. "The fund's in a trust, locked up tight, all done by the book years ago. You've got no case." Linda's fists clenched, and I could see her jaw tighten, but I didn't flinch. I'd known they'd try something like this eventually, and I'd made damn sure they couldn't touch it. Ed adjusted his glasses, peering at me like I was some puzzle he could figure out. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, "hiding it behind our backs, acting like you're above us." I shrugged, meeting his stare. "I don't think I'm smart," I said. "I just know my son deserves his shot, and I wasn't going to let you take it from him." Margaret gasped, clutching her purse like I'd insulted her whole family tree. "We were trying to do what's best," she said. "April's got a real future. College is begging for her. Caleb's just, well, he's my son." I cut in, my voice hard now. "And he's got a future too. You don't get to decide it's worth less than hers." Linda finally spoke, her voice low and tight. "We'll see about that," she said, stepping closer. "You think you've won, Marcus, but I'm not done. I'll find a way." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. She was so wrapped up in winning, in proving she was right, that she didn't even see what she was losing. "Yes," I said, nodding slow, "we will." That threw her off. I could tell. She'd expected me to argue, to yell, but I wasn't giving her the fight she wanted. Not yet. Rachel picked up the folder, clutching it to her chest like it was still worth something. "This isn't over," she said, echoing Linda, but her voice sounded less sure now. I didn't bother answering, just watched as Ed and Margaret exchanged a look, those tight, worried glances they always shared when things didn't go their way. "We'll be in touch," Ed said, like it was some big threat, and then they turned to leave, filing out the door with Linda trailing behind them. She shot me one last glare before stepping outside, and I heard their car start up a minute later, the engine fading as they drove off. I stood there for a second, letting the quiet settle back in, then walked to the kitchen and grabbed my coffee again. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway, leaning against the counter. Upstairs, I heard Caleb's door creak open, and his footsteps came soft down the stairs. He peeked into the kitchen, his hair messy from sleep, his eyes wide. "Was that Grandma and Grandpa?" he asked. I nodded, setting my mug down. "Yeah," I said. "They're not happy, but it's fine. Nothing's changing." He bit his lip, looking at the floor. "They're really mad, huh?" I walked over, putting a hand on his shoulder. "They can be mad all they want," I said. "You're still going to college. That's what matters." He looked up at me, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Thanks, Dad," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. I smiled back, ruffling his hair a little. "Go get some breakfast," I said. "We've got a day to get through." He nodded and shuffled to the fridge, and I watched him for a minute, feeling that quiet pride settle into me. Linda and her family could throw whatever they wanted at us, lawyers, threats, guilt trips, but I'd built that trust for Caleb solid as a rock. They weren't getting through it. Not today, not ever. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug, ready for whatever came next. The days after Linda's family stormed out of our house felt different, like the air had shifted somehow. Things didn't explode again. Not yet. But there was this quiet heaviness hanging around, like we were all waiting for the next punch to land. I kept busy with work, coding late into the night at my desk in the spare room. The glow of my computer screen the only light in the house after everyone else went to bed. Caleb was different too, though, and that's what I noticed most. He'd been so quiet since the dinner, like he was carrying the weight of it all on his shoulders, but little by little, I started to see him come back to himself. It was small things at first, his guitar strumming through the walls again, soft and hesitant, like he was testing if it was okay to play. One afternoon, I came home from grabbing groceries, the plastic bags rustling as I set them on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, Linda off at work or maybe plotting with Rachel somewhere. I didn't care enough to ask anymore. I heard Caleb's guitar then, louder than usual, coming from his room upstairs. I smiled to myself, unpacking the milk and bread, letting the sound fill the space. It wasn't just noise. He was working on something. I could tell, the way the chords looped and changed, like he was building a story with them. I finished putting stuff away and headed up, knocking lightly on his door before poking my head in. He was sitting on his bed, the guitar across his lap, a notebook open next to him with scribbled words and crossed out lines. "Hey, Dad," he said, looking up, his fingers still resting on the strings. "Hey, Bud," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Sounds good. What's that one?" He shrugged, a little shy, but I could see a spark in his eyes. "Just something I've been messing with," he said. "I entered a contest at school, a music thing. Figured I'd give it a shot." I nodded, stepping inside and sitting on the edge of his desk chair. "That's great," I said. "You've got a real gift, you know that?" He ducked his head, but I caught the small smile before he hid it. "Thanks," he mumbled. After everything, I thought maybe I should try harder. Prove I can do it." My chest tightened, a mix of pride and ache, because I knew what he meant. Prove it to Linda, to Rachel, to all of them who'd written him off. "You don't have to prove anything to anybody," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I'm glad you're doing it for you." He looked at me then, his dark eyes serious, and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "For me." We sat there for a minute, just listening to the quiet, and I felt like something was clicking into place for him, like he was starting to see he didn't need their approval to be who he was. A few weeks later, things really shifted. It was a Tuesday night, and I was in the kitchen making dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and some sauce from a jar. Caleb came bounding down the stairs, his footsteps loud and quick, and burst into the room with a grin I hadn't seen in months. "Dad, I won," he said, holding up a piece of paper like it was a trophy. I turned from the stove, wiping my hands on a towel. "Won what?" I asked, already feeling my own smile start. "A short story contest," he said, his voice bright. "First place. They're publishing it in the school magazine and everything." I dropped the towel and walked over, pulling him into a hug before I could stop myself. "I knew you would," I said, clapping him on the back. "I knew it, Caleb. That's amazing." He laughed, a real, happy sound, and handed me the paper, a certificate with his name in big letters, Caleb Reynolds, first place, right there in black and white. I held it up, reading it over, feeling that pride swell up so big it almost hurt. "We're framing this," I said, and he rolled his eyes but didn't argue. We sat down to eat, just the two of us. Linda was working late again, and he told me about the story, some quiet piece about a kid finding his way in a town that didn't get him. "Sounds familiar," I said, winking, and he laughed again. It was the best night we'd had in a long time, just me and my boy, the weight of everything else fading for a little while. Meanwhile, word started trickling in about April, and it wasn't good. I'd overheard Linda on the phone with Rachel one night, her voice tight and low, saying something about rumors and cheating. I didn't ask, I didn't have to. A couple days later, Caleb came home from school with the scoop. "People are saying April cheated on her last exam," he said, tossing his backpack on the couch. "Like, big time. Caught with notes or something." I raised an eyebrow, stirring the pot of soup I was making. "That's so," I said, keeping it casual, but inside, I couldn't help the little twist of satisfaction. The golden child wasn't so golden after all. "Did Mom say anything about it?" Caleb asked, grabbing a soda from the fridge. I shook my head. "Not to me," I said. "She's been quiet lately." And she had. Linda hadn't brought up the college fund or the lawyers since her family's visit. Maybe she was licking her wounds. Maybe she was planning something else, but I didn't care. Caleb was finding his footing, and that's what mattered. "Think it's true?" he asked, popping the can open. I shrugged. "Doesn't matter if it is," I said. "She's not your problem." He nodded, taking a sip, and I could see he was letting it go, focusing on his own path instead. By the time dinner was ready, Caleb was back to talking about his next contest, a song this time. And I listened, really listened, letting his excitement fill the room. He was turning a corner. I could feel it, stepping out from under all the crap Linda and her family had piled on him. And me? I was just happy to be there, watching him rise, knowing I'd fought for him to have this chance. The rumors about April were just noise, funny noise, sure, but Caleb's wins? Those were real, and they were ours. Graduation day rolled around fast, like time decided to speed up just to get us there. It was a warm Saturday in June, the kind of day where the sun sits high and bright, making everything look sharper, cleaner. I was up early, ironing my shirt in the spare room, the steam hissing as I smoothed out the wrinkles. Caleb was still in his room, probably wrestling with his tie. I'd heard him muttering about it through the wall. Linda was downstairs, moving around the kitchen, but we hadn't said much to each other in weeks. Ever since her family's lawyer threats fell flat, She'd gone cold. Barely a word, just glares and silence. I didn't mind. My focus was on Caleb today, making sure he knew this was his moment, not hers, not anyone else's. I finished with my shirt and pulled it on, buttoning it up slow, checking myself in the mirror. I wasn't young anymore, lines around my eyes, a little gray in my hair, but I felt good, steady. Today wasn't about me, but I wanted to look right for my boy. I headed downstairs, the smell of coffee hitting me as I walked into the kitchen. Linda was there, sipping from a mug, dressed in a navy dress that looked expensive and stiff. She glanced at me, her lips tight, but didn't say anything. "Caleb, almost ready?" I asked, pouring myself a cup. She shrugged. "He's taking forever with that tie," she said, her voice flat. I nodded, not pushing it, and took my coffee to the living room to wait. Caleb came down a few minutes later, his cap and gown slung over his arm, the tie crooked but tied. "Good enough?" he asked, holding his arms out. I grinned, setting my mug down and walking over to fix it. "Close," I said, straightening the knot, smoothing it out. "There. Now you look like a graduate." He smiled, a little nervous, a little proud, and I clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got this," I said. He nodded, and we headed out to the car, Linda trailing behind us, her heels clicking sharp on the driveway. The ceremony was at the school's football field, rows of chairs set up under a big white tent, the air buzzing with chatter and laughter. We found seats near the front. Me, Linda, and a space between us that felt wider than it looked. Rachel and her crew weren't there, which was a relief. I'd heard she'd backed off after the cheating rumors about April got louder, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with her fake smiles today. The principal stepped up to the podium, the microphone crackling as he started the usual speech about hard work and bright futures. I watched Caleb up there with the other seniors, his cap tilted a little, his hands fidgeting in his lap. My boy graduating. It hit me hard, right in the chest, how far he'd come. The names started rolling, kids walking across the stage, shaking hands, grabbing their diplomas. When they called Caleb Reynolds, I stood up, clapping loud, not caring if I looked silly. He glanced my way as he took his diploma, a quick smile flashing across his face, and I felt that pride swell up again, warm and strong. Linda clapped too, but it was stiff, polite, like she was doing it because she had to. I didn't let it bother me. This was his day, not hers. He came back to his seat, diploma in hand, and I leaned over, whispering, "Proud of you, bud." He grinned, whispering back, "Thanks, Dad." Then the principal stepped up again, clearing his throat. "Before we finish," he said, "we have one last award to present. This year, we're honoring a student who's shown not just academic growth, but resilience and talent in the face of challenges. The Spirit of Excellence Award goes to Caleb Reynolds." My jaw dropped. Caleb froze, his eyes going wide, and I heard Linda suck in a breath next to me. The crowd clapped, a steady roar, and I stood up again, cheering as Caleb got up, looking dazed but happy. He walked back to the stage, the principal handing him a plaque, shaking his hand. I kept clapping, my hands stinging, watching my boy stand there, tall and sure, soaking it in. "Well deserved," I whispered to myself, sitting back down as he returned to his seat. Linda didn't say anything, just sat there, her face blank, unreadable. I glanced at her, trying to figure out what was going through her head, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. The rest of the ceremony wrapped up quick after that. More speeches, the caps flying into the air, kids hugging and laughing. We found Caleb in the crowd afterward, his gown unzipped, the plaque tucked under his arm. "Surprise, huh?" he said, grinning at me. I laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Big surprise," I said. "Couldn't be prouder." Linda stepped up then, her arms crossed. "Congratulations, Caleb," she said, her voice tight, like it hurt to get the words out. He nodded, looking at her for a second, then back at me. "Thanks, Mom," he said, but I could tell he didn't expect much more from her. We took a few pictures, me and Caleb mostly, Linda standing off to the side, and headed to the car. The ride home was quiet again, but it wasn't the same heavy silence as before. Caleb was in the back, flipping through his diploma and plaque, a small smile on his face. I caught his eye in the rearview mirror and winked. He winked back. When we got home, I ordered pizza, his favorite, pepperoni and extra cheese, and we sat in the living room, eating off paper plates, talking about college and his music. Linda stayed in the kitchen, picking at a slice, not joining us. I didn't push her. She'd made her choice, pulling away, and I wasn't going to beg her to see what she'd missed. Caleb told me about the award, how it came with a little scholarship money, and I listened, letting his excitement fill the space. Today was his victory, and I was just happy to be part of it, watching him shine after everything they'd tried to take from him. The sun set outside, the room going soft and warm, and for once, it felt like we were okay. Just me and my boy, moving forward. With Caleb's graduation behind us, life settled into a strange kind of rhythm over the next few months. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at my desk, coding software that kept my mind busy and the bills paid. The house felt emptier now, with Caleb getting ready for college, packing boxes, sorting through old clothes, his guitar always within reach. Linda was still there, physically at least, but she'd pulled back even more, like a ghost drifting through the rooms. We didn't talk much, just enough to keep the basics going. Who was buying groceries, whose turn it was to mow the lawn. The coldness between us wasn't new, but it felt sharper now, like a line had been drawn that neither of us could cross back over. I didn't care about her silence, though, not really. My focus was on Caleb, making sure he had everything he needed for the big move to college. We'd spent a weekend shopping for dorm stuff, sheets, a lamp, a little fridge he could keep snacks in. He was excited, I could tell, his eyes lighting up when he talked about the music program he'd gotten into. Seeing him like that kept me going, kept the anger at Linda and her family from boiling over. They'd lost their fight over the college fund, and I'd heard Rachel had stopped calling as much, probably too embarrassed to face us after everything. Good riddance, I thought. We didn't need their noise. Then the rumors about April started getting louder, turning into something solid. It was late summer, the air thick and humid, when I got the full story. I was in the garage, tinkering with an old radio I'd been meaning to fix, when Caleb came out, his phone in hand. "Dad?" he said, leaning against the workbench. "April's done. Like, really done this time." I set down my screwdriver, wiping my hands on a rag. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my tone casual even though I was curious. He scrolled through his phone, reading off a text from a friend. "She got caught cheating again, second time this year. Ivy League school pulled her admission. It's all over school group chats." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back against the wall. "Caught how?" I asked. Caleb smirked, a rare little twist of his lips. "Notes in her sleeve during a test. Teacher saw it, reported her. Rachel tried to fight it, but the school's got proof, pictures, and everything." I let out a low whistle, shaking my head. "Well, that's that," I said. "Golden Girl's not so golden anymore." Caleb nodded, pocketing his phone. "Mom's freaking out about it," he said. "I heard her on the phone with Aunt Rachel last night. Sounded bad." I shrugged, picking up the screwdriver again. "Not our problem," I said, and I meant it. Whatever mess Rachel and April were in, they dug it themselves. That night, though, Linda came to me. First time she'd started a real conversation in weeks. I was in the living room, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, when she walked in, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "I need to talk," she said, her voice strained, like she'd been holding it in too long. I set the book down, looking up at her. "Oh," I said, keeping it light, but I could see the tension in her face, the way her jaw was set. She hesitated, shifting her weight, then sat on the edge of the couch across from me. "Rachel's struggling," she said. "April might not get into college at all now. They're saying she could lose everything, scholarships, reputation, all of it." I leaned back, folding my arms. "Not my problem," I said, echoing what I'd told Caleb. Her eyes flashed, a little spark of the old fire, but it didn't catch like it used to. "Marcus, this is serious," she said. "Rachel's a wreck. They don't know what to do." I nodded slow, letting her stew for a second. "Sounds rough," I said, "but what's that got to do with us?" She swallowed, her hands twisting together in her lap, and I could tell she was working up to something big. I was wrong," she said finally, the words coming out like they hurt her. I raised an eyebrow, surprised but not showing it too much. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. "About Caleb," she said. "About everything. I shouldn't have tried to take his money for April. I see that now." For the first time, I saw something real in her eyes, regret. Maybe, or at least the start of it. I didn't say anything right away, just watched her, letting the silence stretch out. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think she'd finally figured out what she'd done to our son, to us. But another part, the bigger part, didn't trust it. She'd spent years tearing Caleb down, siding with her family over him, and one apology didn't erase that. Okay, I said finally, keeping it short. You were wrong. What now? She looked up at me, her face tight, like she'd expected me to jump at the chance to fix things. I don't know, she said. I thought you should know. I nodded, picking up my book again, signaling the talk was done. Noted, I said. She sat there for a minute longer, then got up and walked out, her footsteps soft on the carpet. I didn't watch her go. Later, I found Caleb in his room, packing a box of books. Mom say anything to you? I asked, leaning in the doorway. He shook his head. Not really, he said. She's been weird all day, though. I nodded, stepping inside. She's figuring out she bet on the wrong horse, I said. He smirked, taping the box shut. Karma, huh, he said. I laughed, a short, dry sound. Something like that, I said. We finished packing in quiet, the weight of Linda's words still hanging there, but not heavy enough to change anything. Not yet. Caleb was moving up, and I was right there with him. That's what counted. Fall came quick after that summer, the leaves turning gold and red outside our little suburban house, the air crisp enough to need a jacket in the mornings. Caleb was gone now, off at college a few hours away, and the place felt too big without him strumming his guitar or leaving his sneakers by the door. I dropped him off a couple weeks back, helped him set up his dorm, hung his posters, plugged in that little fridge, made sure he had everything he needed. He'd hugged me tight before I left, his voice muffled against my shoulder as he said, "Thanks, Dad, for everything." I'd driven home with the windows down, letting the wind drown out the quiet, feeling proud but lonely too. My boy was on his way, and that was good, but it left me alone with Linda in a house that didn't feel like home anymore. She'd been different since that night she admitted she was wrong. Quieter, less sharp around the edges, like the fight had gone out of her. I didn't trust it, though. Too many years of her picking at Caleb, siding with Rachel, putting me last. It didn't just vanish with one sorry. I kept my distance, sticking to my routine, work, coffee, fixing stuff around the house. We moved around each other like strangers sharing a space, polite but empty. I'd catch her sometimes, staring out the kitchen window or sitting on the couch with her phone dark in her lap, like she was lost in her head. Maybe she was thinking about Caleb, about April's fall, about where it all went wrong. I didn't ask, didn't want to. One evening, I was in the garage again, sanding down an old wooden chair I'd found on the curb, something to keep my hands busy. The radio was on low, some old rock song humming through the static, and the smell of sawdust filled the air. Linda came out, her shadow falling across the workbench, and I looked up, surprised. She had on a sweater and jeans, her arms crossed like always, but her face wasn't hard this time. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice soft, almost nervous. I set the sandpaper down, wiping my hands on my pants. "Sure," I said, leaning back against the bench, waiting to see where this was going. She took a deep breath, like she'd rehearsed this. "I've been thinking a lot," she said. "About us, about Caleb, about everything I did. I know I messed up, Marcus. Badly. And I don't know how to fix it." I nodded slow, keeping my eyes on her, letting her get it out. Seeing April crash like that. "It made me see how wrong I was to put her over Caleb," she went on. "He's doing so well, and I didn't believe in him. I should have." Her voice cracked a little, and I saw her blink fast, like she was fighting tears. Part of me wanted to feel something, sympathy, maybe, but it didn't come. Too much had happened. "Okay," I said, my tone flat. "You see it now. What's that change?" She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, like she was hoping for a lifeline. "I don't want to lose us," she said. "I know I've been awful, but maybe we could try. Rebuild, start over." I let that hang there for a minute, the words heavy between us, the hum of the radio filling the silence. Rebuild, start over. I'd spent years holding this marriage together for Caleb, taking her jabs, her coldness, because I didn't want him growing up in a broken home. But now he was gone, building his own life, and I didn't have to stay anymore. "I want a divorce," I said, the words coming out clear and firm, like I'd been holding them in for years without knowing it. Linda froze, her mouth opening a little, her eyes wide. "Marcus, wait," she started, stepping closer, her hands reaching out like she could grab the idea and pull it back. I shook my head, cutting her off. "It's too late, Linda," I said. "You don't get to decide you want me now, after everything. I'm done." She stopped, her hands dropping to her sides, and for once, she didn't argue, didn't snap back. She just stood there, looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "I didn't mean to push you this far," she said, her voice small. I thought we could still be something." I shrugged, picking up the sandpaper again, running my thumb over the rough edge. "We haven't been something in a long time," I said. "You made your choices, Rachel, April, tearing Caleb down. I stayed for him, not for us. He's gone now, and I don't see a reason to keep pretending." She flinched, like the words hit her harder than she expected, and I saw her eyes shine with tears she didn't let fall. She nodded slow, like she was accepting it even if she didn't want to. "I'll move out," she said, barely above a whisper. "Give you space." I didn't answer, just went back to sanding the chair, the steady scrape of it loud in my ears. She stood there a minute longer, then turned and walked back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. I kept working, the wood smoothing out under my hands, and felt a weight lift off me. Light at first, but growing. It wasn't joy, not yet, just relief, like I'd finally let go of something I'd been carrying too long. The next few days, she packed quietly, suitcases in the guest room, her clothes disappearing from the closet. I didn't watch, didn't help. She left a note on the kitchen table one morning. "I'm sorry, Marcus, for everything." And then she was gone, the house mine alone. I stood in the living room, looking at the empty space where her stuff used to be, and took a deep breath. It was over. No going back. Caleb called that night, checking in, and I told him. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice worried. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. "I'm good, bud. How about you?" He laughed, telling me about his latest song, and I smiled, listening. We were moving on, both of us, and that was enough. 3 years flew by faster than I'd expected, like someone hit fast forward on my life. It was Christmas Eve now, the air cold and sharp outside, snow falling soft and steady, piling up on the windowsills of my new place. A small cabin just outside town, nothing fancy, but mine. I'd moved here after the divorce, wanting a fresh start away from that old suburban house full of ghosts. The cabin was wood and stone, with a big fireplace in the living room that I'd gotten going tonight, the crackle of the logs filling the space with warmth and a smoky smell I'd grown to love. Caleb was with me, home from college for the holidays, sprawled out on the couch with a mug of hot chocolate, his guitar leaning against the armrest. He'd changed, taller somehow, more sure of himself, his dark hair longer and messy in a way that suited him. I was in the armchair across from him, a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The room was cozy, lit up with a string of lights I'd hung along the mantel, a little tree in the corner decked out with ornaments Caleb had picked out when he was a kid. It felt right, being here with him, just the two of us. He'd thrived at college, landed a music deal last year with a small label, his songs starting to pop up on local radio stations. I'd heard one driving home from work a few months back, his voice coming through the speakers, and I'd pulled over just to listen, grinning like an idiot. My boy was making it, step by step, and I couldn't have been prouder. Linda? She was still around, somewhere. I didn't keep tabs on her much after she moved out. Caleb saw her now and then, mostly holidays or quick visits, but he didn't talk about it a lot, and I didn't push. From what I'd pieced together, she was still bitter, clinging to whatever was left of her bond with Rachel, who'd faded into her own mess after April's cheating scandals. April never did get into college, not that I heard, anyway, and Rachel's big dreams for her crashed hard. Linda had tried calling me once, maybe a year ago, leaving a voicemail about catching up. I didn't call back. That chapter was closed, and I wasn't opening it again. "You ever think about Mom?" Caleb asked, breaking the quiet, his voice casual but curious. He was looking at me over the rim of his mug, steam curling up around his face. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the question settle, then shrugged. "Not really," I said honest. "You?" He chuckled, a low sound that reminded me of myself sometimes. "Not much," he said. "She texted me last week, asking if I'd visit. Told her I'd see. Probably won't." I nodded, setting my cup on the side table. "Good," he added, grinning a little, and I laughed, the sound mixing with the crackle of the fire. We sat there for a minute, comfortable in the silence, the snow tapping soft against the windows. I leaned back, stretching my legs out, feeling the heat from the fire on my feet. This was what I'd wanted: peace, a real family. Even if it was just me and Caleb now. The last few years hadn't been easy, selling the old house, starting over here, finding my footing alone, but they'd been worth it. I'd rebuilt my life, piece by piece, and it felt solid, like this cabin. Simple, strong mine. Work was steady. I'd picked up hiking on weekends, even started fixing up old furniture again, like that chair from the garage days. Little things, but they added up. Caleb set his mug down and grabbed his guitar, strumming a few chords, the sound warm and familiar. "Wrote something new," he said, glancing at me. "Want to hear it?" I nodded, leaning forward. "Always," I said. He started playing, his fingers moving easy over the strings, his voice low and steady as he sang. A song about roads stretching out, finding your way, leaving shadows behind. I listened, really listened, feeling the words hit me in a way that made my throat tighten. It was about him, about us, about everything we'd walked through together. When he finished, the last note hung in the air, and I clapped, slow and loud. "That's a keeper," I said, my voice rough. He smiled, setting the guitar down. "Thanks, Dad." We talked for a while after that, about his music, his classes, the girl he'd been seeing who liked his songs almost as much as I did. He asked about my hikes, laughed when I told him about the time I tripped over a root and landed in a creek. It was easy, natural, the way it should have always been. The fire burned lower, the logs shifting with a soft thud, and I got up to toss another one on, the sparks flaring up bright. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white, and inside, we were warm, safe, together. Later, he yawned, stretching out on the couch. "Think I'll crash," he said. "You good?" I nodded, standing up with my empty cup. "Yeah, bud. Sleep tight." He grabbed a blanket from the back of the couch, pulling it over himself, and I headed to the kitchen to rinse my mug. Standing at the sink, I looked out the window at the snow piling up, the woods beyond dark and still. A true family, I thought at last. Me and Caleb, that's what we were now, and it was enough. More than enough. I turned off the light and headed upstairs, the glow of the fire fading behind me, carrying that quiet contentment with me into the night.